This is a very special occasion. My name is Ali Amida, the coordinator for the Featherman Distinguished Lecture in the Humanities, and this is our annual wonderful event. The lectureship is established a while ago in 1998 by our Emeritus President Sandra Featherman and her husband Bernard Featherman. And it was one of those really visionary attempts to bring distinguished scholars, civic activists, and original thinkers to UNE, and also to make sure that people in the community at large can recognize and understand UNE as a thriving and developing, emerging university in southern Maine. We have, because of this generosity and vision, we were able to bring some of the brightest and most brilliant original thinkers to UNE since 1998. Among the speakers we had in the past, the late Biddeford, the eminent scholar Thaddeus Koshpo, the eminent scholar Liz Perry from Harvard, this country's leading scholar on China, the leading scholar on Korea, Bruce Cummings, my professor at the University of Washington, who is now at University of Chicago, and also Professor Mahmoud Mamdani, one of the leading Africanists, and the late Ali Mazroui, one of the most foremost scholars in the world on Africa. They all came to UNE, and we were able to interact with them. Our students had a great opportunity in meeting them and talking with them and reading their scholarship and presentations. It's with great pleasure I would introduce this year's Featherman Fund Distinguished Lecturer, our Dean, Dr. Jeanne Hey. I'm not going to talk about her CV and her education and so, but I'm tempted to talk, and I cannot afford not to mention that she has a bachelor's degree from Bucknell University, and also she has a Ph.D. from the Ohio State University. And if you don't want to, forget about the fact that she is a very, very great fan and followers of her university. Even though she left that university a while ago, I would say I don't think of anybody who is so enthused and so committed to the Buckeyes as Jeanne Hey.
Except for my husband.
Yes, that's maybe you chose him. Jeanne is a specialist on international relations, and what we need to know about Jeanne's credentials and background that probably some of you don't know, because she has been a dean and doing with a lot of administrative and taking care of the College of Arts and Sciences at UNE. She is a specialist on foreign policy, and not just foreign policy in general. She is among a few group of scholars who studied third world countries' foreign policy. And she has studied Latin American foreign policy, and she did field work in various countries like Colombia and also Ecuador. I can think of only a few scholars who had that kind of original, interesting focus. The eminent Egyptian scholar Bahjat Karani, who is now back in Egypt. Jeanne is as a scholar in that field, will give us certain insights about ongoing presidential elections and the question of foreign policy, which is really big for the question that we need to understand. Foreign policy is not an afterthought. Foreign policy is really part of the realities of the world we live in, which is interdependent, interconnected, interlinked, more than we sometimes think or sometimes we know. And I think Jeanne is going to share with us her Featherman Fund lecture with the title, The 2016 Presidential Election and the Future of American Foreign Policy. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dean Jeanne Hey.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ali. What a joy to hear Bajat Korani's name. He influenced me a lot when I was a young scholar, and that's wonderful. Am I turned on, Dave? I am? Great. And everybody can hear me. Thank you, Dr. Amida. Ali is always too kind. I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that not many people look at third world, that term third world foreign policy. When I was first starting out studying mostly Latin American foreign policy, and if I was at the dentist or a cocktail party or whatever, and people would say, oh, what do you study? And I said, Latin American foreign policy. Almost without exception, they said, oh, U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America. And I said, no, Latin American foreign policy, in my case of the Andean regions, towards the rest of the world. And then, almost without exception, it was like, oh, so they have foreign policy too. And so I am actually moving a little bit outside of my own field today by talking about U.S. electoral politics and U.S. foreign policy, but I thought this would be a topic that would be interesting to a broad audience. Let me also begin by thanking Dr. Ali Amida, who's one of the best organizers of lectures known to humankind. And I'm glad I didn't know until today that people the likes of Theda Skocpol and Betty Friedan had come before me, because I'm not sure that I would have accepted. That's really exceptional. And also, I certainly want to thank Sandra Featherman and Bernard Featherman, but especially Sandra, not only because we at UNE are all living the legacy of her remarkable leadership, but I especially personally have benefited so much from her advice, kindness, good nature, encouragement. Really, it was a conversation with her that pretty much got me to apply to UNE, and here I am. So thank you so much. So with that, let me begin. It's funny that we're here talking about the 2016 election more than a year in advance of when that election actually happened. So it's a peculiar American phenomenon. You know that just yesterday there was a national election in Canada, which saw a sweeping change there from the Conservatives to the Liberals. I was in Canada and Nova Scotia specifically in August of this year, very few short months ago, when that election was announced. So in August, they said we're going to have a national election in October, and now it's over. A number of years ago, I was living in Scotland looking at Scottish politics, and there was a Scottish national election there. It actually brought the nationalists to power. It was a fascinating time to be there. And by statute, there was a rule that campaigning was limited to 5 weeks. So not years, not months, but weeks. And interestingly, I never heard anybody complain in either of those places that they didn't have enough time or information to make their choice. So this growing, pretty soon we're going to be having debates, I think, in about year 1.5 maybe of the administrations. So a lot could happen between now and this time next year, not to mention whenever the new president is seated and into his or her administration. But with that, I'll do what I can. So before I get into any specifics about particular candidates, excuse me, I'm one of those people with the glasses on and off. I want to just give a few observations, kind of set the stage for some of the things that we need to keep in mind and think about when we're looking at this particular election from a foreign policy point of view. And the first is that this election is not about foreign policy. And if you examine, for example, the campaign websites, or listen to the debates, or look at the conversations, or evaluate the stump speeches of the different candidates, you'll find that foreign policy is very often not mentioned at all, and if it is, in a very cursory way. It's really interesting. So for example, on, I believe, Hillary Clinton's website, if you click on issues, she's got about 20 different issues there that you can read in detail about her policies, and 2 of them immigration, and then so-called national security concern international politics. And hers is probably the most robust. So I think a student of foreign policy has precious little, really, to find in the current debate about foreign policy of the candidates. So, so if you want to understand what's going on in foreign policy circles right now and debates, don't look to this campaign, really, to find it. Second, I would say this election is a demoralizing time for those of us who care about international politics and diplomacy. And why is that? Because we know, and history tells us, that diplomacy and international politics, even regional politics, are very complex, nuanced issues that require an understanding of history, culture, personalities of leaders, the political dynamics going on in any country, resource, power distribution, everything. Complexity is the defining characteristic of this, yet there's little or none of that complexity shown in the debates that we have. Rather, the foreign policy conversations are often reduced to kind of silly sound bites. So for example, we see some really easy punching bags like Vladimir Putin or the country of Iran or ISIS as just easy go-to statements, but that really aren't very helpful or nuanced. So for example, in the Republican debate, I don't know, maybe about 3 weeks ago now, the group was asked, how would you deal with Putin? And as soon as you hear a conversation where an entire country, especially one as large and complex as Russia, reduced to a single person, you know that the conversation is not going to be very nuanced. No matter how powerful any given individual is. The idea that everything that happens in that country is reduced to his proclivities it's just facile, and we see a lot of that. So, Putin becomes Russia, or Russia becomes Putin. Cuba becomes Castro, and so forth. So, for example, Carly Fiorina, when asked about dealing with Putin, says, "I wouldn't talk to him. Instead, I would build up the Sixth Fleet and arm his enemies and send more troops into Europe." So, and big applause line, right? But not very really realistic or nuanced or thoughtful. And similarly in the Democratic debate, when Hillary Clinton, I guess all of the panel were asked, who are your enemies? We all make enemies in political life. Who are yours? And she said the Republicans, a few other, some lobbies. And then she said the Iranians, and that was also a big applause line. But that really concerned me. First of all, it showed that, again, this Iran as the bad guy, very facile, very simplistic, and dangerous, was being used by the leading candidate of the Democratic Party. And second, to throw around something like that, she wants to be president. She's a former Secretary of State. And to say, oh yeah, I'm enemies with Iran, doesn't seem to portend a very positive foreign policy towards that region under a Hillary Clinton administration. And I don't even believe that she wouldn't be a thoughtful leader in that area. I'm just saying that in the context of the campaign, those kinds of kind of silly and simplistic lines seem to draw attention more than a nuanced discussion of competing interests, working with our allies, and so forth. So I'm sad, but have gotten used to that in American political campaigns, the working assumption seems to be that the public knows little about foreign policy, cares even less, and that to talk about the details of foreign policy problems is a losing proposition. And that you can get away with cheap shots like talking about Islamic extremism, Russian dictators, drug lords, and so forth, and you'll get a big rousing applause. Or alternatively, talk about kind of vapid concepts of freedom, democracy, human rights, all of which are good things, but not meaningful in most of our campaign language. And then a third contextual issue is that I'm finding it very difficult to discern what the foreign policy debates really are about. And here, this is when you know you've gotten old, when you start sounding like somebody who's nostalgic for the Cold War. But, you know, when you know, in the second half of the 20th century, you know, we knew what U.S. foreign policy was about and what the important debates were about. It was about the bipolar distribution of power, the good guys, us, democracy, freedom, that kind of stuff, or so we said, and then communism on the other side. And this was not a partisan issue. It was both Democrats and Republicans exploited this alike. And the master of this, of course, was Ronald Reagan. And I know the students in the room, you know, came to this earth after the Reagan administration, but he was really the last and best example of that. So the conversation was about who's going to win that, and it was also about peace versus war. Really big questions, you know. 30, 40 years ago, we were talking about the nuclear arming of the world. Some of the most important interest groups in the United States were things called like FREEZE and SANE. Again, the young people in the room probably never even heard of these organizations, but they were about trying to limit and in fact disarm nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. People my age grew up frightened that we were going to get blown up the next day. And the thing we always heard was, they have so many bombs that you could blow up the world 20 or 2,000 times. I mean, that was something, it was really part of our national conversation. And it's just not anymore, you know, at least as far as I can tell. So the nuclearization of the world, except in the context of Iran, is really off the table. The whole idea of good guys and bad guys, except maybe in the context of Islamists, extremists, or jihadis in the Middle East, it's pretty much off the table. And so I don't see any kind of dimension or axis of conversation where the different players in this election can grab onto and say, I'm pro this and my opponent is X that. Instead, when you look at US foreign policy in these debates, it's really, the term whack-a-mole just kept coming up into my mind, because our foreign policy conversations really seem to be reactive to the most recent crisis or problem that has emerged. Oh no, now we've got this organization called ISIS. What are we going to do about it? And then we whack it down or not, and it comes up somewhere else. Oh, we've got a difficult leader in Venezuela. Try to deal with it. Oh my gosh, there's global warming. I guess we got to talk about that. So it's very episodic and crisis-driven and reactive, rather than really ideological or thematic. And so I really think this election shows how the United States is struggling with its post-Cold War identity. So with that setting of the stage, I'm going to talk about 4 candidates today. As much as I'd love to talk about the, 15, what's the count this morning? I understand Jim Webb pulled out at least out of the Democrats this morning. But we still have, I believe, 12 Republicans running and at least four Democrats, and probably some independents. I had to make some choices. I'm not going to talk about why, but I'm happy to answer questions. So I'm going to talk about 2 on the Democratic side, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. And then on the Republican side, I'm going to talk about Jeb Bush, who I still think may come out of this, when all the dust settles, like we saw with the guy from New Hampshire, Romney, thank you. There were a lot of other candidates, but in the end, the kind of establishment candidate shone through. I think that may still happen. And then, of course, I'll talk about Donald Trump, because to do so would be to deny both you and me too much fun. I'm going to take each one through 5 issue areas that to me seem representative of the debate right now and also important for our foreign policy future. So let me just quickly tell you what those are. Let me just make sure I'm on the right spot here. The first is climate change. Climate change is both a domestic and an international issue, of course. And I am actually just returned last night from the Arctic Circle Assembly, which is an international meeting of governments, industry, education, and NGOs from all over the world of organizations that have an interest in the Arctic. It was and we were in Reykjavik, Iceland. Francois Hollande, the president of France, spoke. Angus King was there. And Hollande is essentially doing some impressive globe-trotting to try to impress upon important actors the damage and the threat of global warming, and to try to get a strong agreement signed in Paris. There's a major international meeting on climate change in Paris in December. And he gave a very moving talk about that. So overwhelmingly, my impression upon coming back just from Iceland, was it's hard to explain how far behind the United States is in thinking and talking about climate change compared to the rest of the world. That was overwhelmingly my impression. And just to compare, for example, Francois Hollande giving a very impassioned speech with a lot of data, all, understanding that global climate change is real and that we have to attack it dramatically now. In contrast, 2 days later, the United States government delegation, very high-level people from defense, state, interior, and Angus King as well, they were all good speakers, but essentially they were all talking about, we need to start looking at this. It's time for us to collaborate with international partners. And by the way, did you notice President Obama was the first US president to travel to the American Arctic in the history of our nation? Well, that was in August of this year. Obama went to the Arctic region in Alaska. The US is an Arctic country. And what most of us heard about it was that he officially renamed Mount McKinley Denali, right? Well, for the rest of the world, that was about climate change, right? And so there the United States is saying, hey, we're sending our president to the Arctic, and we're going to start these conversations. And everybody else was so far beyond this. So this is an issue that the candidates cannot ignore. So we'll talk about that. Second, I'm going to talk about the Iran nuclear accord that the Obama administration, with a number of multilateral partners, is hoping to get passed in the US Congress in the next, I think, about 2 months. Essentially, after many years and then some very intense weeks by Secretary Kerry just a few months ago, an agreement was reached between the Iranian government and, again, these kind of mostly Western partners that boils down to an exchange of Iran's agreeing to stop its enhancement of uranium and nuclearization progress in exchange for the West lifting economic sanctions that Iran has been suffering for some time. So, and that instantly became a political football. It was discussed at length in both of the debates. Right now, we're kind of in a quiet period where Congress is supposed to be looking at it. But that's one of the issues that is batted around in the election. The third issue I'll talk about is what to do and whether to intervene in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and about ISIS, or the so-called Islamic State. Now, I want to say off the bat that I'm not happy about lumping those very different problems together. Each one is unique. They have some things in common, other things not. Afghanistan is not in the Middle East, for example. But I do so for the purposes of brevity, but also because in the debates, and I don't mean just the debates up on stage that the candidates have, but just in our national conversation, those things are often talked about together. The main questions in this topic include, how should we manage the multiple bad actors in Syria, which include the Assad regime, first of all, ISIS, and now Russia, which we know has started air wars there. How should we prevent the collapse of the regime in Iraq that we've supported for a long time to ISIS and others? How shall we similarly prevent the collapse of the regime in Afghanistan, mostly to the Taliban? And of course, you all know that in very recent days, the Obama administration announced that, contrary to its original policy, it's not going to bring back the troops from Afghanistan, but it's going to leave them there for some time more. Next, I'll talk about immigration, which is also a domestic as well as a foreign policy. Here, the main thing that is debated, well, there are two. One is about the so-called comprehensive immigration reform. When you hear that term, know that what the person's talking about is, what on earth do we do with the more or less 11 million undocumented, illegal, whatever you want to call them, immigrants in this country who do not have formal legal status, as well as many of their children. And also, second, what do we do about our border with Mexico? How do we keep Mexicans, but increasingly Central Americans, who are coming mostly from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, to the United States via Mexico? And how do we manage that? And then finally, I'll talk about trade. As much as trade is a comprehensive issue of national importance, the trade conversations among the candidates is really simplistic. It seems to have been reduced to whether the recently promoted TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the Obama administration has negotiated with 10 other, I believe it's 11 signatories, Asian countries, not including China, whether it's a good or a bad thing. And then also, is China a trade partner that we want to work with? China is a major trade partner, but it's also an easy punching bag. So with that, let's start looking at what we've got. So let me begin by, after I read up about all these guys, I kind of thought, what would they say about foreign policy if we could read their mind? Not what they say in the microphones, or at least the ones that they don't know are on, but if we could read their mind. And this is kind of a summary. So for Hillary, she'd say, I was Secretary of State, goddammit. Trust me on foreign policy. And I'm using their first names here in a nod to something that I love about the culture of Maine. Many of you know that I moved here from 24 years in Ohio, which is a very political state. It's a purple state, so it gets a lot of attention. But it's big, it's got something like 11 million people, and we do not call our senators and congressmen by their first names. So when I moved to Maine, and everybody's talking about Angus and Olympia and Shelley, and I really thought that was neat, so I thought I'd do that. Bernie would say, foreign policy isn't my thing. Can we talk about labor and workers' rights and economic inequality? He's really quite thin on this. He'll talk about it if asked, but it's not his go-to place. The Donald would say, the whole world will love me, just you watch. And that's really, his primary answer to foreign policy questions is, I'll be great. And then finally, Jeb would say, I'm better than my brother at this stuff. Just don't make me explain why. Which may be true. my sense is that he feels dogged by questions about his brother's administration when he really wants to talk about his own administration. He's not particularly articulate at distinguishing himself from his brother's legacy. So let's first look at climate change. So for Hillary is on record as saying that global warming is real, it's human created, and it's a threat. That distinguishes her from a number of Republican candidates. She has gone on record as being against the Keystone Pipeline for both climate change and other reasons. And her climate change policy, her prescriptions, are essentially about finding alternative energy, solar, wind, geothermal, and others. So if you're looking to a Clinton administration, you will at least have somebody in the Oval Office who believes climate change is real. Her policy prescriptions, I think most environmentalists would say, are a little bit tepid. Bernie is by far the strongest on this. He says global warming is human created, real, and a grave threat. He talks more in greater detail about alternative energy, and he calls for very strict emission standards on automobiles and other power plants and other things like that. And he distinguishes himself from others by saying that we should have a carbon tax so people who use devices, vehicles, or work in plants that create a lot of carbon should be paying for it. Mr. Trump is a little all over the place, but mostly he says that global warming is not human created, human generated. It's possible that the world is getting warmer, but there certainly isn't evidence that it's due to human activity. Instead, there's so much fluctuation that you can't say. And he has said more than once, we had such a cold winter in New York last year, so I don't think that climate change is real, which is the cold zones and weather undercuts his claim. When asked, but shouldn't the United States be doing something about it, he says, well, look, China's not doing anything, so why should we? Their power plants are much more damaging than ours, and so let's just say he doesn't have a particularly sophisticated set of talking points around this. I think it's fair to say he doesn't consider climate change a real problem and wouldn't prioritize it. Jeb, this theme is going to come up a lot. Jeb wants to sound like he's normal and listens to scientists, but he knows that there's a side of his base who is deeply suspicious of the whole climate change idea. So he has said, it looks like the Earth is getting warmer. But the science is not clear. He uses that over and over to say that either it's getting warmer in a way that's dangerous or that human activity is causing it. So that kind of leaves him without policy prescriptions because he hasn't been convinced that this is a real problem, or at least that human activity is creating it. He's not willing to say, I don't believe the Earth is getting warmer, which distinguishes from some of the other Republicans. So if we were going to look left to right, left being defined here as climate change is a serious problem and we got to act on it, to I'm going to ignore it, I think it would look like this. The administrations of Sanders, Clinton, Bush, and Trump, it would be that way on a continuum. Let's look next at the Iran nuclear accord. Again, it's really interesting. This just emerged in recent months, and it's become one of the things that the candidates are talking about. So what do people have to say here? So the main question is, do you support the deal or do you not? And of course, Obama, that Obama's name is associated with it is part of the reason that it's played out that way. Hillary says, yes, I support the deal. And here she's pulling a little bit of the Jeb stuff too, where she wants to look normal and say, I support the deal, but then she also wants to show how tough she is against those nasty Iranians. Remember, she identified them as her enemy, right? So she used Ronald Reagan's words in her support by saying, Ronald Reagan famously said, trust but verify in dealing with the Soviets. In other words, sure, I'll sign agreements with them. I'll trust them to live up to whatever they've agreed to do, but we're going to put in verification regimes to make sure that they do. Well, so Hillary went one better than Ronald Reagan and said, with working with the Irans, I'm going to distrust and verify. In other words, that she would say, she'd assume they'd be trying to break the deal and approach her monitoring that way. She also, over and over again calls Iran a ruthless, brutal regime, in many respects well-deserved. And it reminds me, watching Hillary really reminds me of an important moment in my own thinking about her candidacy 8 years ago when she was running for the nomination against Barack Obama. I was really interested in her and thought she was a pretty promising candidate, but I don't know, I can't remember exactly what it was that Iran had said or something like that. And she got up right away and she said, we will obliterate Iran if they take one step towards, I don't know, advancing their nuclear program or whatever. And so, we have in the leading candidate for the Democrats somebody who uses words like obliterate you and that I'm going to take a distrusting approach to you. But at the same time, I support the deal, and I hope that it works out. Now, she was Secretary of State for a long time, and she will tell you that this comes from her own experience. Looking at Bernie, again, he doesn't want to talk about this. He says, yes, I support the deal. It's a good deal. Well, what if, Senator Sanders, what if the Iranians don't hold up their end of the deal? Well, then we'll just put sanctions back on them. Can we talk about the U.S. economy now? It's pretty much how he is. So Mr. Trump has had a heyday with this. In the first debate, he called the Iran deal the worst deal in history. This is a man who prides himself on deal making. And in an interview, he said it may lead to a nuclear holocaust. That's very strong language. I mean, even the Republicans who, I think, loathe President Obama, more than anybody else in history, have not used the language nuclear holocaust. But Donald Trump, as we know, part of his charm is that he talks off the cuff. I don't have any sense that he has looked through the steps that lead from this agreement to a nuclear holocaust, but he's comfortable saying it. But what's interesting about him, even though he's the strongest language opposing it, when asked directly, so would you support the deal? Would you maintain it if you were president? He said, sure, He said, deals are, you work with them. If they're good, you keep them going. If they need fixing, you fix them. An interesting thing about him is that even though he's so bombastic, he's very practical at the same time. And this seems to come from his business experience. He said, good deals, bad deals. He's bought companies that were committed to certain agreements that they had signed, and he kind of takes things where they are. And then Jeb Bush has definitely used this as a way to distance himself most clearly from President Obama. He says that on the first day of his administration, he will cancel any deal that the United States has signed with Iran. And by the way, we need to arm Israel more. Almost everything that Jeb Bush says about Iran, and also much of what he says about the greater Middle East and Central Asia more broadly, comes back to Israel. And he is the strongest in his unabashed support, not only for Israel, but for a Netanyahu-led Israel. And as we know, Netanyahu came out very strongly against this. So looking left to right here, saying, yep, I'm happy to work with Iran, to absolutely not. We have Sanders, Clinton, Trump, and then Bush. Looking at the very violent and devastating conflicts in the Middle East and Afghanistan. Where do people stand? Hillary, now she has the most experience here. She was Secretary of State, she was a senator, she's thought about this a lot. At the same time, she's Hillary Clinton, and we know that she kind of tries to have it both ways in many times. She spends a lot of time apologizing for the fact that she voted for intervention in Iraq all the way back in 2003. In fact, reading about these particular issues, it's so fascinating how much of the debate is not about the problems today, but about George Bush's intervention in Iraq in 2003 with this kind of mythical connection to the devastating events of 9/11. And so she's prostrated herself about that and said, I'm sorry, it was a mistake. And then in terms of today, she's basically pretty middle of the road. She says, look, we have troops and advisors in Iraq and Afghanistan. We need to continue to support those governments. We spent billions supporting them, and we should do so. In Syria, she goes one step stronger than the Obama administration by saying that we should have a no-fly zone over Syria. That's a big deal because not only does it bring U.S. military forces and planes into the airspace of Syria, we also know that that airspace right now is being occupied by the Russian Air Force. And she also complains that the Obama administration did not support the anti-Assad rebels earlier, and that part of why Syria is falling apart now, or not just falling apart, but that the rebels are not more successful and ISIS has been able to come in, is because of lack of U.S. support. And so she's definitely breaking with her boss there. Bernie is no war, no time. He talks extensively about how he was one of the very few who all the way back in 2003 opposed the invasion of Iraq, which is true. He's just ideologically opposed to war and intervention, but I got to be careful. He said very clearly in the last debate, I'm not a pacifist. He didn't want people to put that label, you will never use the US military on him. But clearly, of everybody in this race, he's the most suspicious of things going wrong. And who can blame him? They usually do go wrong, right? So out of Bernie Sanders' mouth, you usually hear things like quagmire, and we'll never be able to get out. Our goals aren't clear, all of that kind of stuff. So he says any action we do in this area must be in coalition with our Middle East allies. That's the first time you've heard me say allies. It's pretty amazing how little the conversation in foreign policy even talks about our allies. Again, those of us who study diplomacy despair at that. And the most interesting thing I find about Bernie Sanders is that he actually spends time on the stump talking about reining in that the military-industrial complex. And this is something that President Eisenhower told us about. And the National Security Agency, the one that's been spying on us for the purposes of reducing terrorist threats in the United States. So Bernie Sanders is arguing that things about our domestic culture and government, weapons companies promoting war because it gives them profits, the NSA violating our civil liberties for some unidentified threat. He talks about that, and that's very unusual. Donald, again, what can you say? Well, here's what he says. When asked in the debate, what would you do about ISIS? He says, I'm the most militaristic guy you'll ever meet. And he talks a lot about his support for veterans. Does that mean that he would send the military to Syria? Maybe, When asked specifically, would you use troops on the ground, he said yes if it were necessary. And, but again, one doesn't get the sense that this is part of a strategy as much of, you know, hey, I'm a guy who takes the problems as they come and I use the resources that are available to me. And by the way, I'm going to make the people who are really responsible here pay for it. In this case, it's Saudi Arabia. He's very critical of the so-called Gulf oil states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and a few others, for getting rich off the United States from oil consumption, not just the United States, but the world, and then not being the bearer of the financial and military burdens for maintaining the peace in the Middle East. His big thing is respect. He says, you know, once I'm president, these players will respect me, which also means fear me. And they don't do that right now with Barack Obama. And so that's how I'm going to fix it. And then Jeb, this has been a really tough question for him because, of course, George Bush was the one who made the decision not only to intervene in Afghanistan after 9/11, but eventually Iraq, which almost everybody looks to as an enormous blunder here. And you all probably saw that Jeb really bungled a direct question when asked that. He was asked, would you, if you knew what we know today, would you have intervened in Iraq back in 2003? And he said yes. But he really meant no. And I think he kind of got a bad, what he was trying to say, he was answering the question, if I'd known what my brother knew, would I have intervened? And he was quick to say, and so would have Hillary. She voted for it. But that wasn't the question. So it spent a couple of days trying to backtrack. He finally came out and said, no, I wouldn't have done it. But a lot of damage to his campaign was done. His policy is to enhance the military support that we're giving to the governments in Iraq and Afghanistan, very similar to Hillary. And specifically in Iraq, to use military trackers, US military trackers, not troops, trackers, to support the Iraqi military in its fight against ISIS. Again, for those of us who are old like me, that military trackers sounds a whole lot like the advisors that the US sent to Vietnam for a number of years, so-called saying, we're not putting troops on the ground, we're just sending advisors. Well, soon those advisors were in the tens of thousands, and then came the war. Just as an aside, I don't think any of these people, and certainly not I, have any idea of how to really handle this very distressing issue. So left to right here we have Sanders. I really see almost no light between Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush on this. I think they would handle this the same. And Trump, if you believe his off-the-cuff statements, it could be very militaristic. But as always with him, it's hard to predict. Okay, and finally, immigration. Now, as I said earlier, the main question on immigration is, do you support comprehensive immigration reform, and what do you do about the border? Hillary's been very clear on this. Stop deportations, which the Obama administration is doing, and she agrees with comprehensive immigration reform with a path to citizenship. That's really critical. Yes. Even if people came here through smugglers, you know, somehow illegally, don't have papers or a green card, I think, I'm being Hillary here, that not only do we not deport them, but we have to find a way to integrate them into society as legal workers and eventually citizens. And So that's different from what we have now, although I think the Obama administration would probably support that. They had been unable to come up with a comprehensive immigration policy. Now, on what to do at the border, you'll see Hillary distinguishes herself from others. She's still pretty hardline on the border. So we should maintain the walls, we should maintain the current highly militarized infrastructure there, and patrols. Bernie is by far the most, let's say, liberal or generous on this. So he says yes to comprehensive immigration reform with a path for citizenship, but he goes even farther. He's very articulate about the rights of the immigrants, which, again, is almost absent in this conversation otherwise. He says that immigrants should have legal representation within our system, similar to indigent criminal defendants. And he calls for higher wages for immigrant workers. Again, something that's just off the charts for most of the conversation. And unlike Hillary, he calls for a demilitarization of the border. Disarm, to some extent, the border police. Don't build any more walls. He really looks at the immigration issue and says it's immoral how we're doing it. And even if they're Mexicans or Central Americans, we're not treating them in a humane way. Donald's on the exact other side. So he famously said, it was one of the first things he said after announcing that he was going to be a candidate, that Mexico is sending murderers, rapists, and presumably some good people. And here we are in a learned auditorium in an institution of higher learning where we care about values of human rights and everything. For some of us, the fact that his stock and his polls soared after that was really a bit of a tough thing to take. When asked what's he going to do, again, he's just amazing. He says, I'm going to build an enormous wall, the whole border, and I'm going to get Mexico to pay for it. And he's reiterated that many times. So that was not just an off-the-cuff thing. In terms of the so-called illegal people that are here now, he's going to deport them all. He says we just have to do it. He calls for an end to birthright citizenship, meaning if you're born in this country, you get a U.S. citizenship. Nobody else is saying that. And he also talks about making immigration expensive. Applying for visas or driver's licenses, or when you get caught, very high fines. He's talking about making the disincentives to coming to the United States much greater than the incentives. We can talk more about how we're going to get Mexico to pay for it later, but he actually has an idea for that. Now, Jeb is a very interesting Republican on this. He was the governor of Florida, which has a very heavy Hispanic population. His wife is Mexican. He speaks Spanish, something amazingly Donald Trump seems to find as a deficit or a detriment to Jeb Bush's qualifications. I mean, he literally said something like, the President of the United States should not speak Spanish. So Jeb has these multicultural children, and he talks a lot about the great relationship he has with the Hispanic community in Florida, all of which is laudable. But he also uses that to prop up his anti-immigrant status. And so, for example, he says, my wife is not in favor of comprehensive immigration control. She's in favor of having a wall, and so forth. He says yes to comprehensive immigration reform, but no to a path to citizenship. Instead, he talks about some kind of legal status that has not been defined yet, but it would be short of citizenship. So if you've come to this country under something other than legal ways, he would hope to find a way for you to stay and work, but you couldn't become a voting U.S. citizen. And he talks about even greater enforcement on the border, greater military use and so forth. So on this one, left to right, we have Sanders, Clinton, Bush, Trump. Pretty clear distinctions among the four. Trade, Hillary is pro-free trade, but then this is Hillary's thing. She always wants to have it both ways, or almost always. She'll be a very pro-free trade president. You know, her husband negotiated NAFTA. She's a strong supporter of NAFTA. That was the beginning of the free trade era. But then just a few weeks ago, she came out and said, I oppose the TPP for very small, kind of inarticulate reasons. This is the take on Hillary, is that she can't help herself to try to pander to specific groups, in this case, mostly labor. Bernie is by far the clearest. He is against free trade. If you listen to him, he pretty much thinks that NAFTA was the beginning of all evil that has come to the working class in the United States. He opposes every free trade agreement that comes to him, and it's a very strong issue for him. Donald, what can you say? This is a man who's made a lot of money selling things to international actors. He says, you know, I'm not necessarily for free trade, I'm for fair trade, by which he means trade that benefits the United States. But what I think is interesting about that is that I bet he doesn't know that fair trade is a term that's been used by the left for decades now to talk about trade that does not disadvantage people in mostly in the so-called third world, like coffee growers, banana growers, and you know that we often in the West and the North pay prices that may be high or fair here, but that very little gets down to the growers. So here we have Donald Trump using that same expression, fair trade, that like in my house means buying coffee that we know that a certain percentage of that price is going to the Colombian coffee grower. And for Donald Trump, it means that the U.S. gets more out of trade with China. He talks a lot about China and Japan killing us without a lot of detail. He talks about increasing tariffs, and he says, you know, what we need are good negotiators, and Trump hires good negotiators. Jeb is the most pro-free trade of the bunch, with the exception of Cuba. He has the regular take on Cuba. Okay, so on this one, Sanders exactly against free trade. Trump kind of all over the place, and I think Clinton and Bush really would be the same. Okay, so to sum up then, I've taken you through these different policy prescriptions. There's not really an enormous amount of variation. But let me just sum up what I think would be the foreign policy profile of each. For Hillary Clinton, at first, she looks slippery and pole-driven, like that TPP thing that I was just telling you about. But then I thought, maybe she's nuanced and complex. I'm not sure which it is. She's hard to pin down, which you could say is a negative trait, or maybe she's just embracing the complexity. What to expect from a Clinton administration? I think much of the same. The whack-a-mole. Bernie Sanders, he's not about foreign policy, except as it affects US workers and soldiers. He talks about soldiers and veterans. What to expect? I think a Sanders administration would retreat. There'd largely be inaction, and he'd pull back from some agreements that we're already part of. A Donald Trump administration, first of all, he says, well, I don't want to talk about it too much because I don't want to give away my plans. Then the other guy would know, you never tell your position to the opponent. His word is respect. That when I'm president, actors are going to respect me. And because I'm a good negotiator, and that's how we're going to get things done. He doesn't have specific policy proposals. It's about him being an object of respect and his negotiating skills. And he says, I'm the best delegator on the planet. I'll get the smartest people, and that's how I run my business, and that's how I'll run the government. What to expect? I have no idea. But I don't expect the U.S. will have many allies. I think his kind of bombastic approach is going to alienate a lot of our partners. And finally, Jeb Bush. I really think Jeb Bush and Hillary, when it comes down to it, are very similar. But when I say without the signature issues, Hillary is strong on things like women's rights, children's rights internationally, and I don't see Jeb having kind of signature issues that way. He's also not talking about global warming. So when we think about doves to hawks, Sanders will be the most dovish. Clinton and Bush will use military force and intervention, as they see needed. And if we are to believe his rhetoric, Trump would be the most hawkish by far of the batch. So then I have this. Yeah. So just this is what you've all seen. So to finish then, I would not recommend that any of us get our hopes too high, that the 2016 election is going to bring us some dramatic shift in foreign policy or some dramatic success in figuring out our world's problems. There's, first of all, it's not a very high priority for any of the candidates compared to domestic issues. And second, the forces aligned against any leader, and Obama has certainly struggled with this, the forces aligned against any dramatic action are just too great. The issues are so complex. The bureaucracy, the size of the bureaucracy that implements our foreign policy would boggle your minds. The military interests, they all conspire to really constrain how much a leader can do. And just to give you an example of that, let me remind you that when Barack Obama came into power, he did so with a promise of closing the Guantanamo prison in his first year. As crystal clear and seemingly doable policy as you could pick. And here we are 7 years later, and the Guantanamo prison is not only open, but still serving its long-standing prisoners. So for me, the biggest takeaway is really in some ways not all of this, what they're saying they're going to do, but I think rather how the rest of the world is looking at us. I think how our partners and enemies, if you want to call them that, how they perceive any of these individuals is what's most important. And what do I mean here? Again, I'll go to the Obama administration. You'll recall when he came into the presidency, the world was so desperate for something other than George W. Bush that in 2009, they gave Obama, do you remember, the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, this is the guy who said, foreign policy, I really don't have much experience there, before he was even a year in office. And the committee said it was because he was so groundbreaking on climate change in the Islamic world and using the United Nations. Nobody today would look at the Obama administration and say that it's been distinguished in any of those areas. I mean, little policies here and there. I think it was their cri de coeur of saying, please give us some leadership that we can get behind. And they were hoping that that would be Obama. But those forces conspired against him. So let me end by just asking, what would the world say about these different candidates? First of all, I think for Trump, from that perspective, it would be very devastating. They look at him, as best I can tell, as a weird American, quirky, cultural figure, getting global heads around the idea of Donald Trump as the leader of the free world just is mostly unimaginable. Add to that the fact that he takes pride in putting others down and throwing insults. I think it would not situate us well for our standing in the world. Bernie Sanders, I think he has a very limited foreign policy exposure. He's against free trade, which is the main way that we interact. So it's kind of hard to say. He's a bit of a question mark there. Jeb Bush would find it very difficult to come out from the taint of his brother, fair or not. So I think he would start with the world from a couple of steps behind. So I think from this point of view of looking at foreign policy and asking who is the world going to embrace, the best situated candidate is really Hillary Clinton. She established herself as a very able Secretary of State. She's charming. People like her. She was the globetrotter without peer, and there's strong consensus that the world respects her, thinks she's smart, and they generally have a good feeling about the Bill Clinton years because of how much they differ from the George W. Bush years. So, so from that point of view, I think if we have a leader who's going to be in the best position to engage in the world, it's probably Hillary. If we ask how different are these leaders going to be, the answer is not as much as we might hope or expect. And with that, I say thank you.
Thank you, Jeanne Hey, for this very meticulous survey and analysis of the foreign policy issue in the current election, despite the fact it's very, very depressing because it looks like it's not really a factor, which is a paradox in the world we're living in as Americans in general. The floor now is open for questions and comments, and we'll start now with you. Go ahead.
I was just curious about your take on the recent coverage of Hillary Clinton's connections to deals that relate to the Clinton Foundation. That's being exposed in a recent publication. The Globe covered it last week.
Yeah, so Dr. Forrest is talking about the Clinton Foundation is Bill Clinton's, actually I think it's technically Bill, Hillary, and Chelsea Foundation, which has had not a small impact in a lot of impoverished places around the world. So Bill Clinton runs this foundation, gets a lot of money in the Institute aid and other kinds of projects. Where they've gotten in trouble, and Hillary as a candidate, is accepting money from industries and countries with which we might be dealing, she might be dealing, with which we might have a conflict of interest and so forth. Am I getting that correct? So my guess, and this is totally a guess, is that this will flutter and then go away. Like most things with the Clintons, they're not Teflon, but they're like slow rubber, you know? They kind of absorb things for a while, the emails, and then eventually they go away. And my guess would be something like that with them.
So, Jeanne, what extent do you think these persona is really truly their persona versus the persona their handlers want to do when trying to... Because I get concerned about who they're trying to, and I'll use a bad word, pander to, when they try. So what truly is what they believe versus what is, we're made to believe by their spokesperson. They're putting this on the stage for them.
So Dr. Brazeau's question has to do with, are we seeing the real people? Oh boy. Some of my political science colleagues might be better situated. I studied under a very strong political psychologist, Margaret Herman, and she talked about this a lot. And I would say two things. One is that every single person who runs for president or even senator is an extremely strong personality. Some of them are very good at seeming kind of folksy and or even not very smart or something. Like remember Dan Quayle? Again, his students are too young, but he was a senator from Indiana who, once he got in national politics as a vice presidential candidate, people said, "Oh, this guy's a doofus. He's not very smart." If you read his political history, he was a driven, ambitious man who knew what he was about. So I don't think that handlers can overcome any of those personalities. So to a great extent, I think you're probably seeing what you get. But the second point would be there is a variation within any candidate's personality about how much he or she is willing to stick to principle and how much he or she is willing to compromise. That's usually said in a bad way. Like if you're not willing to stick to principle, then somehow you're a bad politician or a bad person. But compromise is the art of governing, right? On that dimension, Sanders is clearly the most his own man. And Trump and Sanders, I would say, are the most their own men. I doubt very much, look, Bernie Sanders would not have the haircut he has if he listened to his handlers more. Nor, I hope, would Donald Trump. So, on the flip side, and perhaps not surprisingly, the establishment candidates, both Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton, are much more willing to make those compromises in order to appeal to a particular group of the electorate. I think Hillary's TPP flip-flop was a perfect example of that. So I think they are who you think they are. They're just a lot more willing to compromise, which is usually seen as a bad thing, but isn't always necessarily.
One follow-up question. So to what extent are the media is clearly playing a role in this, right? To what extent is the media's, I'm going to make an opinion, media's reluctance to really engage in the tough questions driving this election too? Because we like the sound bites, but you never see folks getting to these really tough questions like you've done a great job analyzing it.
I completely share your frustration. When I say that the conversation about foreign policy is not very nuanced, what if the questions were? What if the questions demanded a nuanced understanding and a show that you get the details of the complexities of the challenges we face? For whatever reason, and the media writ large will tell you that they give us what we want, but I think the most recent coverage of the Democratic debate is illustrative of what Dr. Brazeau is saying. The famous email question. Somebody asked Hillary Clinton, this email thing keeps dogging you. What are you going to do about it? And she gave whatever standard answer is. I've answered every question. I want to talk about the issues. And then Bernie Sanders came and he said, this isn't very politic of me, but people in this country are sick and tired of hearing about your damn emails. They care about income inequality, the distribution of wealth in this country, the jobs, the housing. Can we please talk about what really matters? And we were all like, yes, yes. So what was the coverage the next day? Bernie Sanders saves Hillary on the emails thing. Like, his very message was the opposite of what we got. It was very disheartening.
Let's take somebody.
Find some
Middle.
students.
And
Yeah.
Thank you for this very good talk, and I'm depressed now because they're all letting me down in your analysis. A pretty ordinary bunch in some ways, except that I spent a long time in Washington, first as a reporter and later running a tiny little pea shooter foundation that supported many of these issues outside the government and in front of the government in a variety of ways, not necessarily only to the left, but also in some cases to the right. And so I'm a student of surprise, I think I'd say. And one of the things I'd love to hear you discourse just a bit on is what makes a great president is, their reaction to crisis, their reactions and actions in crises, and and the things that surprise us that we didn't think we'd get. In the Obama administration, I'm thinking of Cuba and the move toward normalization of relations. So I wanted to ask you about that factor in your analysis of these four candidates. Who might surprise us the most?
That's a really interesting question. And also, how might they manage crisis? Let me see. I bet Donald Trump would surprise us the most. Even though I gave a very rough assessment at the end about how he would be received internationally, and I think that that's true, he in some ways reveals himself to be the least calculating of the bunch. In many ways that offends us because he says such outrageous things. But what you learn about looking at him is he's a problem solver and a deal maker. And so, when he said, sure, I wouldn't cancel the Iranian nuclear deal, perhaps he could work something out with a clarity and a who may care about the politics in ways that the others wouldn't.
Let me see. Let's hear from a student, as Jeanne said. Yes.
As the as the next generation of American voters, I feel it's really important to try and figure out who is going to do what they say. How do I discern that? Because it seems like every candidate all the time has said one thing but done something different. And to me, Hillary Clinton's the epitome of that. She stands for gay rights now, but her voting record has shown differently. How would you go about discerning true information from I'm pandering to this group of people to get a vote?
I wish I had a magic wand or, some kind of brain scan on that. Before I get to that, I would say this idea that candidates, or even all of us, should never change our views, I think is flawed. It doesn't surprise me on that particular issue, on gay rights, that people like Clinton or Obama have evolved with it, not only because it was politically expedient, which it clearly was. I'm one who thinks that probably Obama was pro-gay rights from very long ago, but he just didn't think he could manage it politically until he could. But because the culture has evolved on it, I've evolved on it, my family has evolved on it. So I think evolving and maturing in some ways isn't necessarily a violation of the public trust. But there are cases of where people really are saying one thing and doing another. I think on that, certainly you look to your record. And on that, Bernie Sanders comes out the strongest. Bernie Sanders is somebody we've known what he, as a self-declared socialist, has stood for since he was the mayor of Burlington. And he's the same today as a senator after also being a member of Congress for a long time. And Hillary Clinton's probably the most movable. So I would say two things. One, look to their record. And two, look at the specificity of their policy prescriptions. Bernie will say no to free trade. I'm not going to sign any free trade agreements. Well, if he does, he clearly violates that. If you look at Bush and Clinton, they rarely give such clear answers. It's more kind of like, well, a little of this, a little of that, which leaves them room to maneuver.
Okay. We'll take a question from the side. Yes, please.
Do you think the longevity of the election is devastating to the important topics such as foreign policy, because it gives the candidates kind of the ability to kind of move their campaign around based on like the popularity and the public's opinion, and then also do you think it like exposes some of the stuff like the email thing per se that doesn't really matter? So do you think the longevity could really be affecting how politics work?
That's a really interesting question. In other words, does the longevity of the campaign not just exhaust us all and spend untold millions and billions that could presumably go elsewhere, but does it actually affect policy and the quality of politics? I admit to not having thought about it that way. What do you think?
I think it does. I think it exhausts us. I think the money could be going elsewhere. I don't think that the campaigns are necessarily for the greater good of the public in some situations. I think a lot of it is where the money is going and how the candidates are using this money to kind of exploit other candidates and kind of take the money and use it for their personal benefit to get ahead in the election. It's kind of corruption in a way, but
Yeah. I will make one observation. I think that's a really interesting proposition, and you could be right. The one thing that's so interesting is that the bulk of the long campaign now has become in the primaries, where the Democrats and the Republicans are fighting within rather than across. And it's become just an accepted kind of understanding that they'll move to the extremes during that first phase, Republicans to the right, Democrats to the left, and then they'll come back in the center for the national election or the campaign. So I just find that interesting, that it's kind of like an accepted understanding that they'll change their views depending on where they are, and that can't be good.
Yes, go ahead.
Jeanne, in terms of foreign policy, are there presidents whom you particularly admire? Or a president you particularly admire?
I have so many I don't admire. I'm trying to think.
You can go there too.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think in a funny way, because in my own life, I'd probably have to admire Bill Clinton. As flawed a man as he is, and even I could tell you a million different things that he did that were wrong, he was able to stand for some good things, including women's rights around the world. He was strong on that. The whole Balkan thing, which was devastating and horrific, but Bill Clinton brought the parties to the table in Dayton in 1995, I want to say. No, after that. 98 maybe. And brought an unsatisfactory but nonetheless peace to a region where they really were all killing each other in such a horrific way. And his foundation, even though so Clinton-esque, tainted with all kinds of conflict of interest money, is still working on good things. And of all the presidents in my lifetime, if you read interviews with them or hear them speak, he knows the details like nobody else. And plus, I kind of came of age during the Reagan administration, and that was like so horrific that his being a smart kind of foreign policy leader was just refreshing.
Okay, somebody in the middle? Yes, somebody from TA.
I was wondering what the issue of migrants going to Europe and then some actually coming over to the U.S. is a candidate like Bernie Sanders who's focusing more interior U.S. How is he going to deal with the issues worldwide in the globalized world? Mm-hmm. And who's going to be the best to integrate with all these other countries and solve global issues since we're all connected on a global scale?
Right. Yeah. Well, oh boy. So, Bernie Sanders is a smart guy. And even though I think, but his passion is clearly with American workers and American veterans. That's his focus. But at the same time, he understands world problems and you could say his heart is in the right place. If he were really to become president, which I still doubt, it's possible that he might pick, a really gangbuster Secretary of State who had all the interest and engagement in the world, and he might surprise us. We were asked over here, who's going to surprise us? So he might surprise us. And on the immigration question that you said, he's the one candidate talking about quality of life for immigrants in this country. So I would expect he would take that same kind of passion to the European question. Whether he would want to open our borders to Syrian refugees, I think, is another question. Now, in terms of who's the most kind of oriented to solving problems on a global scale, first of all, the United States is simply not good at that. We think in things of largely unilateral approaches, and from everything that I can tell, to talk about multilateral approaches, God forbid you mention the United Nations on any kind of some speech or debate. It's seen as a point of weakness. So I think all of them have trouble. The United States just doesn't approach things that way. But in terms of who'd probably do it best, I'd probably say Hillary. Partly because, the Obama administration wanted to be more engaged than your typical one, and she was a very able Secretary of State.
Yes. Go ahead.
Yes, Glenn.
Yeah, Jeanne, so say something happens that propels international politics to the front and center all of a sudden. Something in the Middle East, or with Russia flexing its muscles, and Iran comes in on the side of Syria, and so something happens. I would assume that you'd say that Hillary would be the best Democratic candidate. Is there anybody that you think would come to the forefront on the Republican side because that just leaps to the front?
And handle it well.
I would assume Carson at Fiorina would drop out immediately. I don't know how you'd feel about Trump, but I know he'd say, "Yeah, I'm going to go in and bomb the hell out of it."
Yeah, I wouldn't put Trump. I wouldn't put Trump at the top in crisis management.
Like Graham or Paul, or is there anybody else that you would see who would all of a sudden then come to the forefront?
It's a really good question. I'm trying to think. So who's out there? So we got Kasich, Paul, Rubio, Cruz. Yeah, I mean, Lindsey Graham's very articulate and experienced about foreign policy, but I usually disagree with what he's saying. But actually, but he's more thoughtful than most about our allies, for example. So I'd probably, in some ways, because I'm a student of diplomacy, so I usually approach things by saying, let's exploit the value of our allies and all the multivariate connections that we have around the world. And I think Bush, in some ways, is probably going to have the most experienced foreign policy team and be the most willing to not pull the trigger too quickly. So he might.
You don't think he'd just pull in the same old guys? Like, Obama pulled in the same old Clinton guys?
Yeah, well, probably. But as I said, he's always running from his brother's record. Even though he says, I'm proud of him, you can tell he's holding his nose while he says it, that he may be under a little bit of pressure to come up with a fresh foreign policy team for exactly that reason. Yeah, and I think Graham probably. I would be, Kasich is another kind of somewhat practical problem solver. He's the rare politician who admits to his mistakes and tries to fix them. So he might shine in a situation like that. Cruz and Rubio, I think probably not. Sorry, I don't have a really easy, here's the guy.
Jeanne, let me follow up this question with a question that might be completely different than the one we raised today. How would you react to somebody would say, as a matter of fact, both Democrat and Republican candidates and presidents they, with minor details, they actually are in agreement about foreign policy. And they might disagree about our domestic policies. But if you look at it from maybe partisan two-party debates, the American foreign policy has been actually two parties are in agreement on the larger scheme of things. They just try to highlight it for a domestic reason and for election reasons, and they hide so many agreements they have.
That's Ralph Nader, and there's a lot to be said for it. That this illusion of choice, the illusion of distinction among the parties is largely that, an illusion that these are really status quo parties working in the interests of a small elite. I think, I mean, you can tell by how I've laid this out that I think there's a lot to say for that. There are some important distinctions. One of the questioners brought it up. Would a Romney administration have changed presidential policy towards Cuba? Probably not. Would a Gore administration have invaded Iraq? Maybe not. I can't say probably not, but maybe not. So even though I think for the inertia that I described before, how hard it is to make real policy, and the similarity of the players, all of that's true. But in the end, some individual policies can have a big impact, like invading Iraq or not. You know, that was a very hard decision the Bush administration made it, the Congress supported it. But if that hadn't happened, we'd be in a very different world today.
Yes, go ahead.
Would you believe it would be better to have a president that's more rigid to his or her beliefs, or a president who's more fluid and adaptive in order to actually get Congress moving and
The latter.
policies passed?
The latter. You know, it's, as I was kind of saying before, it's like this, this directive of American political culture that standing for my principles. In fact, that's this whole Freedom Caucus in the Republicans, you know, that just kind of ousted Boehner and now they can't find a leader of the party. They're saying what we're looking for is principled leadership. And by that they mean somebody who won't give up on the principles that they care about. Now, of course, we all would like that, but that's where we get stalemates. Certainly, everybody needs to have principles, but the art of compromise and adaptability is much more important, I think, in governing and in foreign policy.
Let's take, yes, here.
Yes. So you started to get at the issue of Congress and the fractured nature of our elected representatives in Washington. And so I'm wondering if you could comment on how you think these candidates that you've analyzed and their foreign policy, which ones are going to be able to, because the president can't do everything that they may promise on the stump.
I mean, you'd never know it at the debates, though.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
So how much of what they're talking about on these issues or promising on these issues can they actually follow through with if they were elected, given the fractured nature of our Congress? That's
a really good question, and it was one that was put to Angus King just a couple of days ago when I was in Reykjavik, and somebody, I think, asked, you know, oh, Congress is so broken, and he said, Congress is broken because they can't agree on anything on the really big things. He says, but underneath, on the kind of secondary and tertiary issues, we actually are getting a fair amount done. Kind of basically the stuff that doesn't get on the front page. But a lot of this stuff is primary. So whether or not the Congress passes or approves the nuclear deal with Iran, whether the Senate signs on to the trade agreement, those are primary. So in terms of, you know, the legislative system is more broken today than it has been in my entire lifetime. And it's not my specialty, but as far as I can tell, I don't see anybody who's saying that they are expecting that to change. So one way to look at it would be to say, who's the least divisive of the major candidates? Because right now, Obama is very divisive. So pretty much just by having his name on anything, the entire Republican caucus votes against it just because it's Obama, independent of what it's about. So Hillary's very divisive. On that score, she doesn't do well. She is one of the most either loved or hated political figures that we have. Bernie's staying power, and again, we're more than a year out from the election, so it's kind of early to talk about staying power. Surprises me for the very reason that you bring up. If the Republican caucus and the Republican candidates can get up and talk about the Obama years as if, almost like we've all been living in the Warsaw Ghetto for the last 8 years. That's how horrible it is. What if an avowed socialist comes to power, right? I mean, Obama is a very mainstream guy. And here's Bernie Sanders, who's an avowed socialist. I can't even imagine, how the Republican caucus would deal with that. So even though personally he's not divisive like Hillary is, I think his policy prescriptions have to be. Yeah, Donald Trump has no hope of getting Congress around him with this. But again, he may surprise us. As I argued that in some ways he may be the most practical guy. In some ways, if he kind of turned a more less insulting new leaf and came with, he's the art of the deal, right? He says, that's what I'm good at. I'm a good negotiator. He could surprise us by getting that. And Jeb, he's pretty white bread. George W. Bush did not suffer the kind of congressional turmoil that Barack Obama has. So in some ways, to the extent that Jeb feels like his brother, that might be a little more workable. So I'm saying that way, the Republicans have more chance of getting stuff done than the Democrats.
And we have to remember that Donald Trump is financing his own campaign. The others have to solicit money and donors, and that's a very, very interesting factor.
There's a question up there, the gentleman in the corner.
No?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Ken, you have a question there? Or?
Sure. I didn't know you were done speaking. Jeanne, I'm wondering if you can just say a word about, as you see it, the connection between sort of national interest and foreign policy with the following sort of prelude, which I don't know that I subscribe to or not, but say a defender of Bernie Sanders interpreted his relative silence on foreign policy in the following way: because the political system in this country is so badly infected with big money, and the democratic procedures are therefore so undermined, it's difficult to judge what the national interests of this country are in anything like a democratic way, and therefore relating what's sensible foreign policy in terms of those national interests is difficult to specify until that sort of corruption is handled.
Yeah, I'd say you have a good point. There are some international issues where that doesn't work quite as well. So, for example, the messes, that's not a good word, but the challenges in places like Syria and Libya and Iraq and Afghanistan right now, even if you believe that that was all about oil, remember that whole thing, it's now about more things, and not just U.S. security, but the security of all those people living there. So discerning U.S. interests kind of from a humanitarian point of view, I think we could still do without that observation of it's all money. But on trade, on aid, on things like the Export-Import Bank, on where, like the nitty-gritty of foreign policy that we never see, like what kinds of pressures are being put on a country like Venezuela or Central African Republic to develop in a particular way, that kind of stuff could be very vulnerable to the kinds of pressures that you're talking about, and we wouldn't know. So I think there's a lot to be said for it.
Okay, let's take a couple more. I know you guys were patient. Yeah, go ahead, Carl.
Thank you. Jeanne Hey, could you tell us the position of these candidates on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and with which administration we can best hope to end the conflict?
There's no hope to end the conflict. None. Zero. The question, Madeleine Albright said a really smart thing about this shortly after she stepped down as Secretary of State. Somebody asked her, how are you going to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict? And she said, you learn quickly that you don't solve these intractable problems, you manage them as best that you can. This kind of, more than you might realize, connects with the question that Ken just asked. So I think thinking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict within the context of U.S. foreign policy, it so much centers on Israel and the extent to which the United States is a supporter, funder, backer, armor of the state of Israel. And there are those who will say that that's really a moneyed interest. And I'm not going to get into that debate, but I just kind of observe it. Pretty much, this is a case of where the debate within the United States is such a tiny portion of the global debate. That's true for a lot of foreign policy issues, but especially this one. So almost everybody's foreign policy around Arab-Israeli or Palestinian-Israeli specifically centers on to what extent do we support Israel completely or less than completely. So on that, Jeb is all Israel all the time, right? So I would not expect a Bush administration to make a lot of progress on brokering any kind of peace in that region. Hillary, now you remember, it was Bill Clinton, one of his very first foreign policy successes, that brought Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat to the White House in 1993, I think, and signed an agreement. I mean, Rabin was killed for it not too long after, but I think a Clinton administration would probably behave like the U.S. government has over many decades, which is try to be the broker of peace in the region, but in a way that protects Israel's interests. And I honestly wouldn't know what to expect from either of these. So where is who would I have the most confidence in? I'm sorry, I have no confidence in the United States' ability or anybody's ability to genuinely broker an agreement there that's going to be livable. I think it has been tried so many times by so many people of goodwill, most of whom have then been killed for it. So sorry.
Okay, let's go with another student from TA. Yes.
As a follow-up question, do you think the U.S. does more harm or good, or does more harm than good in the Middle East in general?
Oh my gosh. Can I punt that to Dr. Amida?
Well, I could help you, but not with much. Now, it's your day. I could say that our perception of ourselves in the United States, our foreign policy always does good. The record is mixed. There are a few times where the foreign policy, especially international aid and so, does a lot of good. Quite often, especially during the Cold War era, it was done for expediency and trying to score, points against the other. And in the process, we missed the point to listen to people, as Dr. Hey said, in other countries, including the Middle East, especially in the Middle East, where we are clouded with Orientalist lenses and lack of knowledge about the other. And the minute we try to listen to the others and discover that there are societies there with perspective of public opinion, with diversity, with everything, and connect with that, I think a lot of our goodwill can become a reality.
So, on balance, is the U.S. more a force for good or bad in the Middle East? I think it's so complex that I couldn't do the math for you. By doing the math, I'd give an answer that would just oversimplify the reality. But I will say this. I'm very influenced by a book by a man who grew up in Israel and is a scholar of the region named Shibli Telhami, who Dr. Amita knows well and actually brought to speak here. And he was actually a professor of mine in graduate school. And he has a really good book on this. I'm happy to share it with you. And his point is that so much of what the conflict, not just the conflict, but the unrest in the Middle East comes from the fact for so many years people were living under leaders who were corrupt in Egypt, in Iraq, in Iran, right? And that in many cases, most cases, those leaders were in that position because they were getting money and guns from us. The Shah of Iran is the most obvious example, but there are many others in Iraq, in Egypt, and elsewhere. There are a few examples of that same thing happening by Soviets as well, but the U.S.'s handprint is on that the strongest. And that what we are seeing today is just the reaping of what we sowed decades ago during the Cold War years, where we propped up corrupt leaders because they let us drill for oil there, they sold us their stuff, and they bought our guns. So if today we're trying to help, whether by brokering peace in the Arab or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which I think the U.S. has really been impressive in many ways, or by sending troops to help Iraq, or killing Gaddafi, but look where Libya is today. Even though many of that, some of those are laudable, and we could say in the instance that's a good thing, the larger picture is one in which we really have a lot to answer for and why things are going bad in the first place.
Okay, taking us a step further there, we could be damned for what we have done, or we could be damned for what we don't do. So what if we were to pull out of that region altogether so that we couldn't be a baddie there anymore? Is that a solution? Mm-hmm. Or does that leave us in the position of we see lots of evil and lots of problems and don't try to be a good global citizen? It's really hard, I think, to know the right thing to do absolutely. In very difficult places and very difficult times.
It's not just hard. It's impossible. It is literally impossible to know what the right thing to do is, and even if we could know, to do it. And anything we do, almost just because of who we are and the military and other tools that we have, is going to be a blunt instrument in places where you need very sharp needles. I wouldn't argue for disengagement. I don't think it's realistic. We are an important world power. What I would argue for is greater nuance in policy, in doing everything that we can to become a genuinely respected leader who listens to people rather than just tells them what to do. So I don't have an answer for that. But I want to make sure everybody knows, because Sandra's point is so good. This is why I said to this young man, we're not going to solve this problem. These are insolvable problems. The most we can hope to do is manage them and so that people aren't getting killed at the same rate. And that's where I look to the Balkans, and especially Kosovo as an example of where I think U.S. influence did that. It's still a very tough place to live with all kinds of problems. But the killing, the massacres have stopped.
And I think there are a few steps that our government can do, learning about the others, not supporting dictatorships and corrupt monarchies, and the ability to, for example, before invading Iraq, make sure that the scholars are advising our government, have knowledge about what goes on, and not to react quickly. And I think that learning from mistakes, I think that probably a simple thing, but very, very important. But these things, you're right, Sandra, these are very complex issues, and I will take more than just American foreign policy. Charles.
So I think there is one thing on there that we can solve, or we can at least ameliorate: climate change. And so my question about that is that we have two Democrats who both feel that global warming is a grave threat and is happening. One is more strident than the other. Which has a better chance of actually changing our policy?
Which of those two individuals?
Yes, I mean, Bernie feels more strongly about it, or has come out. Hillary, not so much. Who has a better chance of actually changing how America deals with climate change?
Well, that's a good question. I would probably still say Bernie. Say he made it to the White House. And this isn't my area so much, so tell me if I'm misunderstanding. But there's a lot of policy making on these kinds of things that happens within the executive branch, like standards and stuff for vehicles and everything. The other thing is that an executive can choose to, for example, support particular global treaties. Angus King called for, can we please pass the law of the seas finally? Say Bernie would really promote that. Although, of course, in the end, the Senate has to support those. But I think to the extent that climate change is something where the executive branch alone can do a fair amount of work, more than on some other issues, and he's a stronger executive on it, I would pick him. I just think Hillary, both because the Congress is going to hate, like the Republicans in Congress are going to hate her so much and give her such a hard time on so much, that climate change, just like has happened with Obama, will slip down her priority list, and she's not inclined to be as aggressive on in the first place.
Okay, another question, one last question.
I know you guys are tired. It's a lot to ask.
Well, I would like to thank all of you for coming, especially our guests from TA, and Renee, the headmaster there, brought some students from there.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming.
I would like to thank also President Featherman, Dr. Hay, and also David, and especially Aaron, who helped me organize this wonderful event. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you in our next Featherman Fund Distinguished Lecture next year. Thank you very much.